Carl Jung spent decades buried in ancient texts most scholars dismissed as primitive nonsense, alchemical manuscripts, Gnostic gospels, Eastern mysticism. While the world was racing toward modernization, Jung was digging backward through millennia of forgotten wisdom, and what he found terrified him. The ancients had not guessed at the human soul. They had mapped it with precision that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. And we forgot it all. But here is the part that should keep you awake tonight. Jung realized that because we forgot this ancient code, we are suffering. Depression, anxiety, mass delusions, endless wars. All of it stems from one catastrophic mistake. We abandoned the map, and now we are lost. In 1913, Carl Jung did something that nearly destroyed his career and his sanity. His break with Freud had left him professionally isolated and psychologically adrift. Without his mentor and father figure, Jung descended into what he called his own personal underworld. For 6 years, he documented visions, voices, and encounters with figures that felt more real than the physical world around him. His remaining colleagues thought he was having a psychotic break. Jung was alone, spiraling into darkness, with nothing but ancient texts as his guide. He recorded everything in what would later become known as the Red Book. Page after page of illuminated visions, dialogues with mysterious beings, and symbolic imagery that looked like it belonged in a medieval monastery. Not a 20th century psychiatrist's journal. But Jung was not losing his mind. He was finding something the modern world had buried. He was rediscovering what the ancients called the anima mundi, the world soul. Jungian psychology calls it the collective, unconscious. But that term does not capture what Jung actually discovered. The ancients knew that beneath individual consciousness lies a vast ocean of shared imagery, instincts, and knowledge that connects every human being across time and space. They did not theorize about it. They lived in it. They navigated it. They built entire spiritual systems around mapping its territories. Jung realized he was not the first person to take this journey. Thousands of years before him, mystery school initiates, shamans, and spiritual seekers from vastly different cultures had walked similar paths through the unconscious. They had left detailed maps, but those maps were written in a language modern rationality could not read. They were written in symbol, myth, and ritual. The problem was that by Jung's time, Western civilization had convinced itself that these ancient systems were relics of less enlightened times. Alchemy was dismissed as failed chemistry. Ancient mystical traditions were considered exotic curiosities. Eastern philosophy was seen as impractical. But Jung saw something everyone else missed. These were not primitive attempts at science. They were sophisticated psychological technologies. Consider alchemy. For centuries, scholars could not understand why brilliant minds spent lifetimes trying to turn lead into gold. It seemed like obvious delusion. But Jung discovered that the alchemists were not talking about physical metals. They were unconsciously describing an inner transformation through their work with matter. Lead represented the heavy, unconscious, suffering state of the untransformed human soul. Gold represented enlightenment, wholeness, what Jung would later call individuation. The entire alchemical process, with its bizarre imagery of dragons, lions, kings, and queens dissolving in acid, was a step-by-step manual for psychological transformation. The ancients had encoded the individuation process into chemical metaphors, projecting their inner work onto external matter. It was psychology disguised as chemistry, though the alchemists themselves did not fully realize what they were doing. Jung spent the last 30 years of his life translating these texts back into psychological language. He published massive volumes analyzing alchemical symbolism, psychology and alchemy, alchemical studies, Mysterium Conjunctionis. These were not abstract philosophical exercises. Jung was rescuing the psychological projections that had been lost in the language of chemistry, and what he found was staggering. The same symbolic patterns that appeared in medieval European alchemy also showed up in ancient Chinese Taoism, Egyptian mythology, and the mystical traditions within Christianity and other religions. The same archetypal images, the same stages of transformation, the same warnings about the dangers of the process. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, had independently discovered similar maps of inner reality. These cultures were not identical. The Gnostics were not the Taoists. The Egyptian mystery schools were not the Christian mystics, but Jung found common patterns within their diversity. He called these patterns archetypes. But here is where it gets dark. Jung realized that these symbols were not just appearing in ancient texts. They were appearing in the dreams of his modern patients. People who had never read an alchemical manuscript were dreaming images straight out of 15th century Europe. Patients with no knowledge of ancient Gnosticism were describing encounters with figures identical to those in 2nd century mystical texts. This meant something profound and disturbing. Jung believed the archetypes were not cultural constructs. They were not learned. He theorized they were inherited as innate psychological structures in the brain itself, the same way we inherit instincts. The ancient gods and spiritual figures were not just external symbols. They represented living psychological forces inside every human being, and ignoring them does not make them disappear. When a culture stops acknowledging these archetypal forces, empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Jung discovered, they do not die. They go underground. They become neuroses, compulsions, addictions, depressions, collective psychoses. The archetypes demand recognition. If we do not engage them consciously through meaningful symbols and practices, they will possess us unconsciously through symptoms and suffering. Jung saw this happening in his own time. The rise of totalitarianism in Europe, the obsession with rationality and technological progress while millions were being slaughtered in world wars, the explosion of mental illness in industrialized nations. All of it, he argued, stemmed from the same root cause. Modern civilization had severed its connection to the archetypal realm that the ancients navigated with reverence and wisdom. We thought we had outgrown the need for myth and symbol. We believed science and reason alone would save us, but we forgot that reason is only the surface of the mind. Beneath it lies an entire underworld of instinctual forces that do not care about logic. These forces are what the ancients personified in their spiritual traditions: the shadow, the wise old man, the great mother, the divine child. When we deny their existence, they erupt in destructive ways. The repressed need for ecstasy and transcendence returns as substance abuse. The denied warrior energy comes back as senseless violence. The ignored need for the sacred shows up as existential emptiness and despair. We are being destroyed by forces we refuse to name. And this brings us to Jung's most terrifying insight. The ancients did not predict specific modern events like a prophet with a crystal ball. But they warned of the chaos that comes when humanity loses touch with the symbolic dimension of existence. They warned that building towers to the sky leads to confusion and collapse. They warned that worshipping false idols leads to spiritual slavery. They warned that ignoring the depths of the soul leads to destruction. We see this today. Mass shootings, epidemics of loneliness, political extremism, ecological collapse, environmental destruction. These are modern manifestations of the ancient warnings. They are not random problems. They are symptoms of the same disease, archetypal starvation. We have built a world that feeds the ego and starves the soul, and the soul is taking its revenge. Think about what we have lost. The ancients understood that human beings need more than food, shelter, and entertainment. We need initiation. We need rites of passage that mark our transitions from childhood to adulthood, from ignorance to wisdom, from fragmentation to wholeness. We need symbols that connect us to something larger than our individual existence. Traditional societies understood this. They created elaborate rituals for birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. These were not just social customs. They were psychological necessities. They helped people navigate the archetypal transitions that every human must face. Modern culture has abandoned almost all of this. We are left with graduation ceremonies and retirement parties, hollow echoes of what used to be profound, transformative experiences. The result is that people go through major life transitions with no psychological support, no symbolic framework, no sense that what they are experiencing is part of a larger pattern. Adolescents hit puberty with no initiation into adulthood. They create their own dangerous rituals, gang initiations, extreme sports, substance abuse, anything to fill the void where a meaningful rite of passage should be. Adults hit midlife crisis with no framework for understanding that this is a death and rebirth process that the ancients mapped extensively. Instead of seeing it as a call to transformation, we medicalize it. We treat it as a pathology to be cured rather than a sacred threshold to be honored. Jung believed the only solution was what he called individuation, not a return to ancient practices exactly, but an integration of ancient wisdom with modern consciousness. We cannot go back to living like our ancestors, but we also cannot survive by continuing to ignore what they knew about the human soul. Individuation means recognizing that you contain multitudes. You are not just your conscious ego. You are also the shadow, the part of yourself you deny. You are the anima or animus, the contrasexual energies within you. You are connected to archetypal patterns that Jung believed were millions of years old. Becoming whole means bringing all of this into awareness, not through blind belief, but through direct experience. This is what the ancient mystery schools were designed to facilitate. Initiation rituals, vision quests, contemplative practices. These were not entertainment. They were controlled encounters with the archetypes, supervised by those who had already walked the path. Modern people stumble into these encounters through psychosis, extreme experiences, or psychological breakdowns, with no guide and no map. The results are often disastrous. Jung tried to create a modern framework for this process: active imagination, dream analysis, shadow work, engaging with symbols consciously instead of being unconsciously possessed by them. But he knew this was only the beginning. He knew that Western culture would need to rediscover its own depth or face complete collapse. The ancients understood something we have forgotten. The human being is not a rational machine. We are symbolic creatures. We need stories that connect us to something larger than ourselves. We need practices that honor the sacred dimensions of existence. We need images and symbols that speak to the deepest layers of our being. Without these, we become hollow. And hollow people create hollow civilizations that eventually devour themselves. Look around. We live in a culture that worships productivity but has forgotten purpose. We have more ways to communicate than ever, but we have never been lonelier. We have access to infinite information, but we have lost wisdom. We have conquered the external world, but we are terrified of our own inner darkness. The ancients would recognize this immediately. They called it hubris, the belief that human cleverness can replace divine wisdom, and they knew exactly where hubris leads, to nemesis, to the inevitable correction that comes from violating natural order. Jung spent his entire career trying to warn us. He published hundreds of papers, and dozens of books explaining that the psyche is real, that archetypes are real, that ignoring the unconscious has consequences. But most people dismissed him as too mystical or unscientific. They wanted psychology to be simple. Behaviorism, conditioning, chemical imbalances, anything that did not require them to confront the terrifying complexity of their own souls. But the complexity does not go away just because we ignore it. The archetypes continue, operating whether we acknowledge them or not. The only question is whether we engage them consciously or let them possess us unconsciously. The ancient alchemists knew this. That is why they called their work the Great Work. It was not something you did casually in your spare time. It required total commitment, facing your own psychological lead, your own shadow, your own capacity for self-deception, and slowly, painfully, transforming it into gold, into consciousness, into wisdom. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, and he was very clear about one thing. It is the most dangerous thing a human being can do, more dangerous than physical combat, more dangerous than financial ruin, because you are facing parts of yourself that you have spent your entire life running from. And those parts have power. They can destroy you if you are not prepared. The ancient initiates prepared through years of training, fasting, meditation, study with masters who had completed the journey. Modern people try to do it alone, often without even knowing what they are attempting. They open doors they cannot close. Jung himself almost did not survive his own descent. He documented moments during his Red Book period when he felt he was losing his grip on reality, when the figures he encountered felt more real than his own family, when he could not tell if he was a psychiatrist studying the unconscious or being consumed by it. He survived only because he had the intellectual framework to understand what was happening to him. But here is what he realized during that terrifying journey. The descent was necessary. You cannot become whole by staying on the surface. You cannot integrate your shadow without entering the darkness. You cannot discover the self without facing everything you are not. The ancients knew this. That is why their initiation rituals often involved symbolic death and rebirth. You have to die to your old identity before a new one can emerge. The problem is that modern culture has no framework for this process. We medicalize it. We pathologize it. We treat psychological transformation as mental illness and try to suppress it with medication. We have lost the wisdom that the ancients encoded in their traditions. The hero must descend into the underworld. The seeker must face the guardian at the threshold. The initiate must dissolve in the crucible before reconstituting at a higher level. These were not just stories. They were instruction manuals for the soul's journey, and we threw them away because we thought we knew better. We thought rationality and technology had made ancient wisdom obsolete. But you cannot kill archetypal truth. You can only forget it. And when you forget it, it comes back in monstrous forms. Jung saw this happening on the collective level in Nazi Germany, an entire nation possessed by archetypal energies it could not name or control. He wrote about this in his essay Wotan, describing how the Germanic god of storm and frenzy seemed to possess millions of people who thought they were modern rationalists. Jung warned that when archetypes seize a collective unconsciously, the results are catastrophic. He tried to explain that totalitarianism was not just a political problem. It was a spiritual and psychological problem. It represented archetypal possession on a massive scale. You cannot defeat that kind of force with rational arguments alone. You must also address the psychological and spiritual void that makes people vulnerable to such possession. But nobody wanted to hear it. They wanted simple explanations. Economic anxiety, political grievance, propaganda. They did not want to face the reality that an entire civilization had become unconscious and unconscious people are vulnerable to possession by destructive forces. The same dynamics are at play now, just in different forms. We have not learned. We are still a culture in denial about the reality of the psyche. We still think we can solve psychological problems with technological solutions. We still believe that if we just find the right medication, the right app, the right productivity system, we will finally be fulfilled. But fulfillment is not the goal the ancients pursued. They knew better. They did not promise comfort or happiness. They promised meaning, and meaning comes from engaging with the full spectrum of human experience, light and dark, creation and destruction, life and death. You cannot have meaning without integrating the opposites, and you cannot integrate the opposites without first acknowledging that they exist. This is the wisdom Jung rescued from the ancients. The path to wholeness runs through fragmentation. The path to light runs through darkness. The path to consciousness runs through the unconscious. There are no shortcuts. The ancients tried to tell us this in every way they could. Through myth, through ritual, through sacred texts and spiritual practices. But we stopped listening. And now, we are paying the price. We are a civilization that has forgotten how to undergo transformation. We cling to our identities, our beliefs, our comfort, terrified of the changes that would make us whole. We are living partial lives, afraid to descend into our own depths, afraid to confront what lives in our personal and collective shadows. Jung believed the only hope for humanity was a mass awakening to the reality of the psyche. Not a religious conversion, not a political revolution, but a psychological transformation where enough individuals do the inner work to shift the collective consciousness. He called these people the conscious minority, the ones who refuse to stay asleep, the ones who are willing to face their own darkness so they can bring more light to the world. This is why he spent his life studying diverse ancient traditions. The Gnostics, the alchemists, the Taoists, the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece. Because despite their differences, they had all developed sophisticated maps of the inner world. They had created cultures where the psychological and the spiritual were integrated, where myth was not entertainment, but a living guide, where ritual was not empty tradition, but transformative practice, where the divine was not a distant concept, but an immediate presence in the soul. We can learn from them. We must learn from them. Because the alternative is what Jung called psychic epidemics, collective insanity, societies that destroy themselves because they cannot face their own shadows. We are already seeing it, the polarization, the rage, the desperate search for meaning in all the wrong places. But there is another possibility. We can choose individuation. We can choose to become conscious. We can reclaim the ancient wisdom that Jung spent his life translating into modern psychological language, not by abandoning science and reason, but by recognizing their limits, by understanding that the rational mind is a powerful tool, but not the totality of who we are. The ancients mapped the human soul with terrifying precision. Jung proved it. And now the question is whether we are brave enough to remember what we forgot, whether we can face the darkness within and integrate it, whether we can stop running from the depths of our own souls and learn to navigate them with wisdom. Because this is not about going backward. It is about going forward with eyes open. It is about building a future where ancient wisdom and modern knowledge work together, where we honor both the rational and the symbolic, where we create new expressions of timeless truths for a new age while respecting the eternal patterns that Jung found across cultures and centuries. Jung spent his life fighting for this vision. He knew most people would not understand. He knew he would be dismissed as mystical, unscientific, even dangerous. But he also knew that the truth does not need everyone to believe it. It just needs enough people, the conscious minority, the ones who are willing to do the work. If you have made it this far, you are probably one of them. You feel the emptiness of surface living. You sense that something essential has been lost. You are hungry for meaning in a world that offers only distraction. You are ready to descend. The ancients left you a map. Jung translated it into language we can understand. Now you must walk the path yourself. No one can do it for you. No guru, no therapist, no book. You have to face your own underworld. You have to integrate your own shadow. You have to discover your own relationship with the depths. But you do not have to do it blind. The wisdom is there. In the symbols, in the dreams, in the archetypes that Jung believed live in your own psyche. The same patterns that guided the ancients are still alive in you. You just have to learn to read them. This is the gift Jung gave us. A modern framework for an ancient journey. A way to reclaim the wisdom of the ages without abandoning the insights of the present. A path to wholeness in a fragmented world. The ancients mapped the soul. Jung rescued their work. Now it is your turn to remember. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.